Okay, this is Friday, May 27th, 2016, and we are interviewing Nina Rizzo Renda. That's a nice alliterative name.
Right, you're absolutely right.
And of course, Nina is part of the Rizzo family that owns the Bernardo Winery, and we're interested in finding out your history. A lot about your childhood and some of the buildings and things that were here when you were growing up and what it was like growing up on a winery.
Well, I was born in 1941 in a hospital in San Diego that is no longer there. I think it was called Quintard, and grew up here at the winery. I had two brothers. My brother Ross was 2 years older than I, and my young brother Vince was 2 years younger. And when I think about it now, it was an absolutely ideal place to grow up. I think about it all the time. However, when I was growing up, we were 7 miles from town. From Escondido, Poway was a gas station. That was it. On the corner of Poway Road and Pomerado Road, Benny Brode's father had a gas station. That was it. We did go to school in Poway at, used to be Pomerado, now I believe it's called Midland. That was our school. And I just noticed that Mrs. Van Dam's name was on the school that was there. And she was our principal. And before that, Mr. Cook was the bus driver, and his wife was the principal, Mrs. Cook. So Poway Valley was small. We knew all the farmers, we knew all the people. They were all friends, all very hardworking people, all wonderful, caring people. Took very good care of one another, and we all knew each other's businesses, and they couldn't wait to help out whenever there was a situation. My brothers and I grew up here with my mom and dad. My father and mother were both born in Sicily. My mother came to St. Louis when she was about 3. My father came from Sicily when he was in his early 20s after he served in World War I. He went to Detroit. From there he went to Texas, met my Uncle Tony, who was actually my father's cousin. From there they went to Tijuana during the Prohibition and had nightclubs in Tijuana. And there was a change of government, and they actually literally almost threw them out. They crossed the border into San Diego and opened bars on Broadway during the war. In the meantime, in the late 20s, my father had bought the winery. He had come out here hunting, apparently, and he liked the property and bought the winery, which was an existing winery. It had started in 1889. There were 5 Sicilian partners, and my father bought the winery from them and continued because his family in Sicily had been landowners and had been in the wine business also. So it was very comfortable for him. When we started coming along after my parents married in 1939, and my mother came from St. Louis, and she had been a stenographer, so you can imagine that this was culture shock for her. She was like, where am I going? But she had been out here. Interestingly enough, my father used to sell wine in San Diego to my mother's aunt, who had a liquor store. And he said to her, when she asked him why he wasn't married, well, why don't you find somebody for me? So sure enough, she called or wrote a letter to St. Louis and said, there's a man out here who has a lovely winery and he's very successful, and why don't you come out here and meet him? So my mother, my aunt, and my uncle came to San Diego, met my father, and 3 days later they were engaged, and my mother went back to St. Louis, and then my father went back for the wedding. And that's how it all started, interestingly enough. But my mom came out here, and she was incredible. I'm sure it must have been an incredible adjustment for her, but she did beautifully. I mean, my mom learned to can, she learned to cook, you know, but she was always very, very interested in us. She was on the, she was always had some kind of an office with the PTA at our school. She belonged to the Farm Bureau. She just did things. She always made sure that we went places. She didn't want us to be uneducated farm children. So we always went to the fair, we went to the ice capade. She was always doing things for us, always was a room mother. So she was pretty fabulous. My dad was an incredible man too, extremely shrewd, very sharp about everything that he did, everything that he bought. He bought a lot of property in Escondido and shopping centers and things like that. So very well known at the bank and extremely successful. My father spoke very broken English, but you always understood exactly what he was trying to tell you, because that's the kind of guy he was. A very, very good friend to our neighbors, who were the Dailies. And the Dailies owned, right here, was a cattle guard, and the Dailies owned all of Rancho Bernardo. And Bertha and Lawrence lived where the, well, their house is still there, but
yes.
not far from the inn.
Yeah.
And they were wonderful. They would have us over very often, or my dad would get fish from the fishermen in San Diego and would call them over and say, come over and have dinner with us, because we just got oysters or whatever it was that they like so much. So we were very, very good neighbors. They had one son, his name is George, and he now lives in Borrego. Interesting, wonderful, good, helpful people. They would keep our horses, and we kept our horses where the tasting room is now, was a stable. And we would keep our horses at the Dailies during our school year, and when the summer came, we'd put them there, and my brothers and I would go riding. And Bob and Julianne Williams, who lived over, they had a ranch just on the other side of Espola. They would ride their horses here. We would saddle up and we'd ride down to the lake or wherever, and then we'd come back and my mom would always have lunch for us. These were the kinds of things that I grew up with. As I said, you know, growing up, we certainly didn't ask my mother to take us to town or to visit our neighbor or whatever. We had to make our own way here. And of course, my brothers always worked on the winery property with the men, but my mother and I we never picked grapes, we never did anything like that. And fortunately, my mom always had Mexican help. So I lived a pretty nice life. I still do it. I'm very happy about it. But I often think about all the wonderful things that I learned growing up on the winery property. My mom made her own bread, which I still do. My mother made wonderful pasta. My father was the chef in our house. He cooked everything. And of course, when I was growing up, we had 350 acres here, almost 350 acres. My father grew everything. He grew peanuts one year. We had fruit trees all back in here, peaches and pears and apples and you name it, strawberries. We used to have huge strawberry fields that I did pick on Sunday mornings, because we always had lots of company here at the winery. Every Sunday we had at least 15 to 20 people here. My dad did all the cooking, and it was what we did. That's what we did. After church, we came home and started doing whatever we could to help my father prepare for this banquet every Sunday, and it was always wonderful. We always had pasta, of course, and we always had steaks, because my dad used to get his meat from Toloni's in Escondido, which I think is still there. Mm-hmm. I think the part that I love the most now, having grown up here, is that you learn so much. First of all, you learn that nothing is really a tragedy. You know, if you get hurt, if it was serious, obviously we would be taken to the doctor. But if it wasn't, it was like, okay, now somebody else has to do your job. So you learn that, you know, kind of get over it. And I kind of taught my children that too. You know, just get over it. You'll be fine. You know, there was no time to be coddled about anything. First of all, that was not my parents' philosophy, but we were taught to be strong, to help one another, to be kind. We have always had wonderful, wonderful help. We used to have a lot of American Indian help here at the winery. And of course, we always had Mexican help. And my mother always said, there but for the grace of God. So never, ever mistreat any of those people. They were, my folks were such terrific people. I don't know what kind of education my father had. I'm sure it was not probably what we would have, maybe an equivalent of high school. My mother did graduate from high school, the only one of her 7 brothers and sisters who did. But she was extremely curious about everything. My mother did magnificent needlework, beautiful. I have probably 100 of her crocheted handkerchiefs that she did very fine work with string, really thread, not yarn. And I must have 20 Afghans that she made because she was very, very talented, as was my maternal grandmother. They were people who worked with what they had and in most cases were extremely successful. My brothers and I were hard workers. We did what we were supposed to do. We were not rebellious because that was not what you could do in those days, to be rebellious. You didn't have a choice. But I did go on to college. My father was very proud of me because I was a good student. And so I went on to college. I graduated from the University of San Diego and taught school at St. Mary's for 3 years and then taught in Vista for 4 years until I was married in 1970 and moved to New York. My brother Ross was not a student. He was an incredible craftsman. I mean, Ross could fix anything. He was so special. But he graduated from college and no, I'm sorry, he did not. He went to college and he said to my dad, "Daddy, you're wasting your money and my time." And Ross was very curious about everything. He could fix anything. He could weld. He could make things in wood shop. He was an incredible, wonderful man. Unfortunately, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we lost our young brother Vince in an automobile accident in 1964. But he was more of a student also. Pleased my parents very much. But Ross, after my dad passed away in 1971, Ross was finally able to transform the winery because truly, actually I think it was a trip to New York that he went back to see me, and there's a place called the Miller Ridge Inn on Long Island, and they have it's a hotel and restaurant, but the outbuildings were all shops. And when he came back, this was early, probably almost 40 years ago. When he came back, he decided that he would start turning all the outbuildings into shops, and he did. One of the first ones was the wood shop, which was the shop right next to the tasting room. That he made into I believe it was a silversmith that came in there first, and then he transformed, these were houses along here that were where the workers lived. And so he transformed those into those buildings. And then eventually, did more and more. He added more to the tasting room. And then originally, the tasting room is where V's is now. The coffee shop, that was the tasting room. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, somebody would drive up our long dirt road. We would be sitting in the house or wherever, and somebody would drive in, and one of us, my brothers usually, or my father, would walk over to the tasting room, and we would fill, or Dad or my brothers would fill a gallon of wine out of the big winery, out of the big barrel room. That's the way it was. We didn't generally have filled bottles. Sometimes they did, but then as they became more popular, more people came, they would of course keep things on the shelf. But that was the original tasting room. And then of course they built this, and where the tasting room is now, that used to be the stable and the barn. That was built in the 60s, probably about 1965. that building was built. And it's been the tasting room since that time. But before that, we took wine right out of the big barrel room, which was, but you know, I'm talking, 60 years ago. That was a long time.
Yeah.
And now, it's obviously, you see what a beautiful job Ross did, and now that my nephew Rossi has done. I am so proud of him. He's just an amazing, amazing young man. He has such foresight, and he has such knowledge and experience, and because he's taken so many classes at the University of Davis, which is our big ag school in California, he's done incredible things. I'm very, very proud of him, and I see nothing but good things for the future for the winery.
Well, it certainly is a little jewel.
He is.
Here.
Yes.
And people are always amazed when they come into here in the museum to say, well, you're driving and there's all these houses, and then all of a sudden here's this wonderful winery. So it is a hidden secret, which it shouldn't be, and I think that the marketing program has really eliminated the secret to the point that more and more people are finding
You're absolutely right. When I have a table here at the Arts and Crafts Fair, which are done twice a year, as you well know. I can't tell you how many people come and say, we love this place. When we have out-of-town guests, we always bring them here, always. We've had friends that say, oh, you're associated with the winery. I've been going out there for years. I love to just go out and sit. I'll get a glass of wine and just sit and think about nothing. I can't tell you how pleased I am that so many people know about the winery. It's really a very, very special place. And as you said, it's almost an oasis in the middle of all of this development. And I'm so happy that Rossi is carrying it on, because this will be our third generation of people who have had it, and hopefully he will always keep it and make it even better than it is now. And of course my sister-in-law Veronica does a fabulous job with planting. It's so pretty and green. When my husband Mario and I came out this morning, I just thought it always looks so nice, and you can always look around and see another beautiful plant, another beautiful flower. It's lovely. It's a real destination now, I think, for a lot of people.
Very definitely.
And we're very, very fortunate. People ask me how my father managed to keep the winery going through the Prohibition. Well, as my dad always used to say, he would make sacramental wine. So it was grape juice that turned into wine by the time you got to the end of the road, And in those days, there weren't all these people that, were so, what should I say? They were so quick to, get someone doing that. They didn't do it. We did have, where the jeweler is, above the jeweler was the distillery, and they used to make brandy. And we always had gaugers that used to come out. These were men from, I don't know where they came from, but they were gaugers, and they would come and check to make sure that the seals, because they used to lock up the brandy and put a seal on it so that the lock couldn't be broken unless they said it could be. And my father would always entertain them. They always came for lunch afterwards. You never left here without eating, ever. That was the rule. My dad loved to entertain. And of course he was, between my mother and father, we always had plenty of food. Interesting, I was just thinking the other day that there was in Little Italy, there was a supermarket in those days, not supermarket, but a food place that sold, it was called the Falcos. And I can remember, because, do you remember that? Because when I was growing up, we were a long way from San Diego. We were on the old 395 that went through what is now Miramar Road, that way. And so my dad would buy a whole wheel of Parmesan cheese, salamis, whole salamis. I remember a little storage place that we had across from our house. Then there would be 50-pound bags of beans, 50-pound bags of flour, because we were we didn't have the convenience that we have today, obviously. So DeFalco's is long gone, but Little Italy is making a comeback, which is a good thing because so many of our relatives lived there. But then, of course, when the 5 came through, then they dispersed all over the county. But those were wonderful, wonderful times, and I will always be grateful for having grown up here, because there's a philosophy here that's unspoken. Obviously, nobody said, that this is what you learn. You just learned by doing and by being with the people who cared, and people did care. Everyone. My dad was an avid farmer. Loved it, and now I like to think that I carry on what he instilled in me. And as a matter of fact, several years ago, before my mother passed away at 101, a friend of mine would come out so that and stay with me on the weekends when I stayed with my mother on the weekends, so that Rena could go home. And I would make things that were on the winery property, like the stems from the artichokes, which we call carduna, are boiled and fried. And so I'd make these, and she'd say, "These are delicious. I've never had these before." She said, "You really should write a cookbook." And I said, "Leslie, that's not my thing." And she said, "I will take the pictures and I will be happy to help you with the wording." But she said, "All you have to do is make the food." And as a result, I did. I made the food, she took the pictures, and as a result, we have a beautiful, beautiful cookbook that is really a tribute to my parents, certainly to my parents, to my brother, who continued to grow produce here at the winery, and a legacy for my children and my grandchildren, and certainly for Rossi, because he is so Italian, and he wants to continue our legacy, and he wants to continue learning. He asks me questions all the time about, well, what about this, Aunt Nina? What about that? How did this come about? And so on and so forth. So I share my knowledge because I am, as I say, the last of the Mohegans, because there's no one else in our family that really knows what was or how it was to grow up here, which was a wonderful life.
There was a wonderful story about how the Daly children used to love to come here to eat your mother's bread, and you would like to go to the Dalys because they had white bread. Exactly. And the same thing, we would trade lunches with our friends all the time. The Williamses, of course, had white bread, and when we went to St. Mary's, my brothers and I went to St. Mary's for school. There were a lot of Mexican kids, so we'd trade their burritos for our sandwiches. So it was just wonderful. We didn't think anything about it at the time, but now when I look back on it, I thought life was so simple and really quite wonderful. But the Dalys everybody loved our bread. We have my mom's bread. We had neighbors on that side of the house in San Pasquale who were the Brookers, and they used to love to come and have my mother's bread. She was a legacy. That's what they remember most about my mom, was her bread, because she made fabulous bread. And I have the recipe in my cookbook, and I still make that bread on occasion, because Rossi especially likes it, and so do my children, because it brings back a lot of good memories of my mother, who was... I have a collection of over 200 cookbooks, and I really love your cookbook. Oh, well, thank you. That's very nice to hear. I've heard wonderful things about it, because the recipes are very simple, because that's what we did. Everything was fresh. You didn't eat a can of anything, except for tomatoes. I do put that in there, although I must tell you that we never had cans in our house when I was growing up, because my father would bring in a tractor and trailer filled with boxes of tomatoes, and we could spend maybe 3 days making tomato sauce. And my mom we'd have it all winter long. She canned peaches, she canned pears,
She made jam out of everything that we had. Apricots. We had a persimmon tree, and she learned to make persimmon cookies. We had fig trees. My Aunt Jenny was an excellent baker, and she would come out before Christmas and make these Italian fig cookies from the figs that my father would dry. He would cut them in half, put them outside, and they would dry, and then my aunt would use those. And of course, we always had oranges, and we always had lemons. So we were farm to table way before it was fashionable, because that's what we did. That's what we knew. When something was ripe, and of course we were very seasonal, because when something was ripe, that's what you ate. And unless we didn't freeze things, my mother did can things, so we'd have peaches in the winter or whatever, but it was a very ideal childhood.
Did you drink wine at an early age?
We did. We were always allowed to drink wine. They would put a little bit of water in it, or we'd have a tiny little bit, but we were always allowed to drink wine. So as a result, we were very comfortable, doing that. So that was a good thing.
Well, this has been a really interesting interview, because you've given us so much background about the winery, and I think you've said things today that I've never heard before. I mean, I've talked to Rossi many times, but actually having you here and knowing what it was like back then, it's wonderful, and we really appreciate your sharing your memories.
Thank you.
And
that's very kind of you. It truly is very kind of you. I'm more than happy to share my life here at the winery. It was really quite wonderful. We were very fortunate to have wonderful friends. My father would meet someone and just say, "Come and have dinner with us." Harry Summers, who started Rancho Bernardo, was here very often as our dinner guest. In fact, I have to tell you a funny story. There was Chief Cato was the head of, I think, the highway patrol for the state of California. And my father used to ask the highway patrolmen to come out here very often and have target practice. And somebody would throw up a lemon, and they'd see who could shoot this lemon out of the sky. And one time, this Chief Cato came and had target practice with my dad. And my uncle, right after that, got a speeding ticket. And he said, "Well, I've met Chief Cato, and I don't think you should give me this ticket." And the officer said, "You know what? I'm going to give you this ticket just to let him know that I'm doing a really good job." So we always had very interesting people here at the winery, because my dad would love to entertain, and he loved to have people come out. And they always made the trip, which is interesting, because it was quite a ways from San Diego at that time. But people from Detroit would come out, friends and relatives of my parents. And as I said, it was a wonderful, good life. And I have carried on that tradition by doing a lot of entertaining. I love to cook, I love to entertain people, and I love to make them very comfortable in my home.
Well,
And I think I get it very much from my parents. That's how I feel. It was never a burden. It was always something they loved to do. They loved to entertain people and enjoy their friends. So that was one of the wonderful good things that I inherited from them, along with everything else.
One thing we didn't talk about were the olive trees, and that you did the olive oil for the tuna canneries in San Diego. So you must have had a connection with the coast.
Yes, they did. Well. They had a connection with the tuna canneries, because my father, we used to have a lot of olive trees here, and my dad used to make olive oil, and of course, we didn't sell enough of it here, so he had made a connection with the tuna canneries in San Diego, and they used that to can the tuna, and before they canned it, before they put it in water like they do now, but they still do it in olive oil. Very enterprising.
Yes.
Very, as I said, a very shrewd man, and good businessman. I'm very proud of my father. The first time I went to Europe in 1967, I was in Germany and I didn't understand a word of German. And I thought, this must have been what it was like for my father to go to the United States in the early 20s when there was no television and of course there was no way of knowing another country's food, money, mores, dress. You knew nothing. And he came over here not knowing the language and became extremely successful. And I thought, boy, Dad, you did a fabulous job.
A really smart man.
Yes, yes, very, very shrewd. You know, I guess it shows that you really need, if you're smart, you can make it and do very well. I'm very proud of both my parents, and I am very happy to be where I am today with a wonderful husband and 3 incredible children and 6 marvelous grandchildren. So life is good, and I'm delighted that I had my start here at the winery.
Well, thank you so much.
You're so very welcome. Thank you very much
interview.
for thinking of me.